Imagine two people. Both are 32 years old. Both hold professional jobs. Both gross a combined household income of around $130,000 per year. On paper, this is a solidly middle-class dual-income household, the kind that, by almost every conventional measure, is doing things right. They have retirement accounts. They carry a mortgage. They contribute modestly to college savings. They are, by the standards of their peer group, financially responsible. Then they have a child. Within 12 months, a new line item appears in their budget. It does not come with fanfare. There is no press release, no policy debate, no moment of explicit decision-making. It simply arrives, as most structural costs do, quietly necessarily, and with very little room for negotiation. That line item is childcare. And at the national median for center-based infant care in the United States, it runs somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 per year. In many metropolitan areas, Boston, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Seattle, it is considerably more, often exceeding $20,000 annually for a single child. But let us stay conservative. Let us work with $12,000 per year, a figure that sits comfortably within the range cited by the Department of Labor and the First 5 Years Fund in their annual cost analyses of licensed child care in the United States. At $12,000 per year, over the 5 years that most children occupy some form of paid child care before entering kindergarten, the household above will spend $60,000. That is not an opinion. That is arithmetic. Now hold that number for a moment, $60,000, and ask a different question. Not what did that money pay for, but what did it not become? The S&P 500, over any rolling 20-year period in its modern history, has returned an average of approximately 7 to 8% annually after adjusting for inflation. That is a figure used consistently in long-term financial planning literature, supported by historical return data, going back to the mid-20th century. If that $60,000, instead of being directed toward child care costs, had been invested in a low-cost index fund at the beginning of those 5 years and left untouched for 20 years at a compounding rate of 7% annually, it would grow to approximately $231,000. At 8%, it crosses $280,000. Read that again. A household that spends $60,000 on child care between the ages of 28 and 33 does not lose $60,000. In terms of long-term capital formation, it loses somewhere between $231,000 and $280,000, depending on market conditions, by the time those parents reach their mid-50s. That gap between what was spent and what would become is not a tragedy. It is not a mistake. It is not bad parenting or poor financial planning. It is the result of a structural mechanism embedded in the cost architecture of modern American middle-class life. And most people who experience it never see it for what it is, because childcare feels temporary. You pay for a few years. The child enters school, the cost disappears, and you move on. The expense ends. But the compounding interruption does not. That is the central argument of this analysis. Childcare is not merely a cost. It is a compounding interruption event, a period during which capital that would otherwise be accumulating wealth is instead absorbed by a fixed cost structure that leaves no residual asset, generates no long-term return, and compounds no value for the household paying it. Understanding this mechanism does not require blaming anyone. It requires looking clearly at how costs are structured, how wealth accumulates, and why the middle class, despite decades of dual income growth, has struggled to build the kind of intergenerational wealth that economic logic might otherwise predict. Defining the structural reality to understand how childcare became a wealth interruption mechanism, it helps to understand how it became so expensive in the first place. This is not a recent phenomenon, and it is not primarily a product of the last decade. The divergence between childcare costs and household income has been building for more than 40 years. In 1980, the average American family spent roughly 7 to 8% of household income on childcare, according to data from the U.S. Census Bureau. That figure was notable but manageable, particularly in households where one parent worked full-time and the other part-time, or where informal care arrangements through extended family remained common. The formal childcare industry, as we now understand it, was nascent. Regulatory frameworks were lighter. Labor costs, though not low, were not yet subject to the full weight of professional licensing requirements, staff-to-child ratio mandates, and facility standards that now characterize licensed center-based care. By the mid-2000s, child care costs had risen to consume roughly 9 to 10% of median household income. By the early 2020s, data from the First 5 Years Fund and the Economic Policy Institute indicated that center-based infant care exceeded 10% of median household income in most states and crossed 20% in states with the highest cost of living. The Department of Labor has noted that child care costs have increased at roughly twice the rate of general inflation over the past 25 years. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index for child care and nursery school services has outpaced both headline CPI and wage growth in nearly every year since the early 1990s. To make this concrete, between 1985 and 2023, the median household income in the United States, adjusted for inflation, grew by roughly 25 to 30% in real terms. Over the same period, the real cost of center-based childcare grew by approximately 50 to 70% above inflation, depending on region and care type. The divergence is not subtle. It is a decades-long structural gap that has widened steadily and shows no meaningful sign of reversing. Why is childcare inflated so much faster than income? The answer is not primarily greed, mismanagement, or policy failure, though policy certainly plays a role. The answer is structural. Childcare is an inherently labor-intensive service. Unlike manufacturing, software, or even many forms of healthcare, it cannot be automated. The ratio of adult supervisors to children is not a preference. It is a regulatory and developmental requirement. In most states, the staff-to-infant ratio for licensed centers runs between 1 to 3 and 1 to 4. For toddlers, it is typically 1:4 to 1:6. For preschool-age children, 1:8 to 1:10. These ratios mean that as wages rise, even modestly, the cost of delivering care rises proportionally because labor is not substitutable with capital in the way it is in most industries experiencing inflationary pressure. Add to this the regulatory cost of licensing, facility safety standards, director certification requirements, and liability insurance, and you have an industry where cost reduction is genuinely difficult without compromising quality or compliance. The child care provider is caught between parents who cannot afford to pay more and regulators who will not allow corners to be cut. The result is an industry with chronically thin margins, persistent workforce shortages, high turnover, and a pricing structure that has, over decades, consumed an ever larger share of middle-class household income. This is the foundational reality. The cost trajectory is not an accident. It is a predictable output of a labor-intensive, regulation-constrained, inelastically demanded service in a society that has simultaneously increased the necessity of that service without building the infrastructure to subsidize its scale. To understand why childcare has such an outsized effect on wealth accumulation, it is necessary to understand how it functions within the broader architecture of the dual-income household, because childcare costs do not exist in isolation. They exist as one node in a cluster of fixed costs that together define the financial structure of middle-class family life. The dual-income household is, historically speaking, a relatively recent institution. In 1970, approximately 40% of married couples with children under 6 had both parents in the labor force, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics historical data. By 2000, that figure had risen to roughly 63%. By 2019, it stood near 65%. The drivers of this shift were partly financial. Wages for single earners stagnated relative to the rising cost of housing and education, and partly cultural, reflecting the expansion of professional opportunities for women that followed the civil rights and feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s. The important economic point is this. As dual-income households became a norm rather than the exception, the demand for formal childcare rose significantly. More parents working meant more children requiring paid supervision. This demand increase occurred without a corresponding increase in childcare supply, partly because of regulatory barriers to entry, partly because of the labor-intensive economics described earlier, and partly because childcare center development is geographically constrained by zoning, facility requirements, and proximity to where parents work and live. The result of increased demand meeting constrained supply is exactly what basic economics would predict. prices rose. And because demand for childcare among working parents is highly inelastic, you cannot simply stop working because childcare is expensive. The income from that work is precisely what pays for the childcare. Prices rose without a corresponding reduction in consumption. Parents did not consume less childcare as it became more expensive. They paid more for it, and they absorbed that cost somewhere. Where did they absorb it? The evidence suggests they absorbed it primarily in two places: reduced personal savings rates and reduced discretionary investment. Data from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances has consistently shown that households with young children, particularly those in the 25 to 40 age bracket, carry lower net financial wealth relative to income than comparable households without children in the same age range. The gap is not entirely attributable to childcare, but childcare represents a significant and identifiable portion of that divergence. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. A dual-income household earning $130,000 combined takes home approximately $90,000 after federal and state income taxes. Of that $90,000, roughly $24,000 to $36,000 may go toward housing, either a mortgage or rent in a reasonably located urban or suburban market. Add healthcare premiums, which according to the Kaiser Family Foundation have averaged around $5,500 to $7,000 annually for employee plus family coverage, employer contributions notwithstanding, and the household's fixed cost base before discretionary spending often exceeds $40,000. Child care at $12,000 to $15,000 does not sit on top of a comfortable financial cushion. It sits on top of a structure that already leaves very limited room for wealth accumulation. The critical insight is that the second income in a dual-income household is not functioning as wealth-building capital. It is functioning as a stabilizer for a fixed cost structure that, in many cases, would not exist without it. The child care bill exists because both parents work. The work is necessary in part because the child care bill, combined with housing and health care, makes single-income households increasingly non-viable in high-cost markets. This is a closed loop. The second income underwrites the conditions of its own necessity, and in the process, generates very little surplus for long-term wealth building. This does not mean the second income is irrational or counterproductive. In most cases, the career continuity and long-term earning trajectory preserved by maintaining full-time employment through the child care years produces substantial lifetime income advantages that outweigh the near-term cost. The point is not that parents are making a mistake. The point is that the common assumption that a dual-income household with two professional salaries is clearly accumulating wealth at a meaningful rate is frequently incorrect during the child care years because the structure of fixed costs consumes most of the surplus before it can compound. The compounding loss model, this is the section that, mathematically, carries the most weight. Everything discussed so far has been contextual. Now we need to quantify the actual long-term impact on household wealth using real numbers and historical data. The model is straightforward. We compare two hypothetical households over a 20-year period beginning at age 30 and ending at age 50. Both households are identical in income, tax situation, and baseline expenses, with one exception. Household A pays $12,000 per year in child care costs for 5 years, from age 30 to age 35, and does not invest that equivalent amount. Household B, through any combination of lower child care costs, perhaps via subsidized care, informal family arrangements, or geographic relocation, redirects that $12,000 annually into a low-cost equity index fund for those same 5 years, and then leaves it untouched for the remaining 15 years of the model. First, let's establish the investment baseline. Historical S&P 500 data, compiled across multiple decades and referenced consistently in retirement planning literature, shows an annualized total return, including dividends, of approximately 10% in nominal terms, and approximately 7 to 8% in inflation-adjusted real terms. For this model, we will use a 7% real return, which is a more conservative figure, and the one most commonly cited in long-term financial planning contexts. This is not a projection. It is a historical average of a broad market index over multi-decade periods, as documented by index fund providers, academic finance research, and Federal Reserve economic analysis. Household B invests $12,000 per year for 5 years starting at age 30. Using future value of an annuity calculations at 7% annual compound growth, those 5 years of contributions accumulate to approximately $69,000 by age 35. That $69,000 then compounds at 7% annually for the next 15 years, until age 50, growing to approximately $190,000. If the real return is closer to 8%, still well within historical norms, that final figure rises to approximately $220,000. Household A, having paid $60,000 in childcare over those same 5 years, has no equivalent invested asset. They have not lost $60,000 in any simple accounting sense. They received a service for that money. But in terms of long-term balance sheet position, Household A enters age 50 with between $190,000 and $220,000 less in inflation-adjusted financial wealth than Household B. To frame this differently, a household that spends at the national average on childcare for one child over 5 years and does not otherwise compensate through additional investment will arrive at age 50 with a retirement wealth gap of roughly $190,000 to $220,000 in today's dollars, caused not by any single financial mistake, but by the structural consumption of investable capital during the highest compounding years of their financial lives. The age dimension matters enormously here. This is not an abstract point about compounding math. Capital invested between the ages of 30 and 35 is among the most valuable capital in a person's financial lifetime because it is the longest horizon over which to compound. $1 invested at 30 is worth approximately $7.61 at age 60 at a 7% real return. The same dollar invested at 40 is worth only $3.87 at age 60. The childcare years, which fall squarely in the early to mid-30s for most households, happen to coincide with a period when foregone investment carries its maximum long-term cost. There is also a second layer to this analysis that most households never examine. The foregone investment does not exist in isolation. It compounds against a retirement savings baseline. The household that exits the childcare years with $190,000 less in invested assets is not simply $190,000 behind. It is permanently behind by the compound growth of that $190,000 over every subsequent year of the investment horizon. At 7% annual return, $190,000 doubles in approximately 10 years. By the time the couple in our model reaches age 60, that gap, if not actively closed, will have grown to approximately $375,000 in real terms. This is not hyperbole. This is compound interest applied symmetrically to the absence of capital just as readily as it applies to its presence. Now consider the case of 2 children, which is the current average for American families who are children at all, according to Pew Research Center and Census Bureau fertility data. 2 children in sequential years of childcare, with some overlap in the most expensive infant and toddler years, can easily extend the peak childcare cost period to 7 or 8 years rather than 5, and push total expenditure to $90,000 or more, depending on overlap, care type, and region. At $90,000 in foregone investment, over 8 years at 7% real return, the 20-year compounded wealth impact approaches $350,000. At 8%, it exceeds $400,000. This is the generational wealth figure. This is the difference between a household that enters retirement with meaningful financial security and one that does not. And for the vast majority of middle-class dual-income households who experience this, it occurs without clear awareness, without a discrete decision point, and without any single moment at which the magnitude of the trade-off is made visible. The housing and childcare feedback loop the compounding loss model, as described above, treats childcare as a single isolated cost. In reality, it functions as a first node in a cluster of interrelated fixed costs that reinforce one another and collectively define the financial architecture of middle-class family life. The most important of these cost clusters involves housing. When parents begin planning for children or once children arrive, a significant portion of them relocate, either to suburban communities or to specific school districts within urban areas. This is rational behavior. School quality in the United States is tied directly to local property values and property tax revenues, which means that access to the best public schools is, to a significant degree, a function of housing expenditure. Parents understand this intuitively, even when they do not frame it in those terms. The desire for good schools, safe neighborhoods, and proximity to other families with children drives residential location decisions with a force that is nearly as powerful as income or employment. The consequence is that the housing and childcare costs are not independent variables. They're often codetermined. Moving into a higher-performing school district typically means paying more for housing, either in the form of more expensive mortgage or higher rent. In many suburban markets around major American cities, the premium for a home in a top quartile school district over a comparable home in a median school district runs to $100,000 or more in purchase price, according to real estate research from Brookings and other urban policy institutions. That premium translates to higher monthly mortgage payments, larger down payments, and more capital tied up in an asset that, while it may appreciate, does not compound with the efficiency of a diversified equity portfolio. Elizabeth Warren, writing in The Two-Income Trap in 2003 with her co-author Amelia Warren Tyagi, identified this mechanism with notable precision. The core argument of that book, which drew on bankruptcy filing data, income statistics, and household expenditure analysis, was that the growth of dual-income households had not, in most cases, produced greater financial security. It had produced greater financial rigidity. Because both incomes were now committed to fixed costs, primarily housing and childcare, the household had far less buffer than a single-income household of equivalent income, where one income remained uncommitted and could be deployed in an emergency or downturn. Warren's analysis showed that a median dual-income family in the early 2000s was actually devoting a higher percentage of its combined income to fixed costs, mortgage, childcare, healthcare, car payments, than a single-income family of equivalent income had devoted just one generation earlier. The second income had not reduced financial vulnerability. It had raised the floor of the fixed cost structure, leaving less room to absorb shocks and less capacity to build financial resilience. That analysis from 2003 has, in the intervening 2 decades, become significantly more acute. Housing prices in the United States have risen dramatically relative to income since the mid-2000s. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finance's data from the early 2020s shows that homeowners in the 25 to 44 age bracket carry median mortgage debt that, as a share of household income, is substantially higher than it was for the same age cohort in 1990 or 2000. Meanwhile, real wage growth for middle-income workers has been modest, and healthcare costs have continued their long-term upward trajectory. The result is a cost cluster in which housing, childcare, and healthcare function as a system, each one justifying the necessity of the others, each one consuming capital that might otherwise compound toward long-term wealth. A family that moves to a better school district to avoid paying private school fees in the future may simultaneously increase their housing costs by more than the private school fees they are escaping. A family that maintains both incomes to cover childcare may find that after taxes, commuting costs, and professional expenses associated with maintaining 2 careers, the marginal net income from the second earner is substantially less than its gross wage. This is a housing and childcare feedback loop. The pursuit of residential quality drives housing costs. Housing costs drive the necessity of dual income. Dual income drives childcare demand and cost, and childcare costs consume the marginal income generated by dual employment. The loop does not always result in zero net gain. Most families do accumulate some wealth through this period, but it systematically suppresses that accumulation well below what would be if the fixed cost structure were less rigid. Why most parents do not see it if the financial mechanism described here is as significant as the number suggests, why is it not a central feature of household financial planning? Why do the parents sitting across from a financial advisor at age 32, with a newborn and a dual income and a new mortgage, rarely encounter a clear model showing them what childcare will cost not in annual dollars, but in lifetime compounding? The answer lies in a combination of behavioral economics, social normalization, and the structural opacity of opportunity costs. The first factor is present bias. Human beings are systematically more sensitive to near-term costs than the long-term ones. This is a well-documented feature of economic decision-making, described in behavioral economics research, going back to Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on temporal discounting. in the 1970s and 1980s. The $1,000 check written each month to the Childcare Center is viscerally real. The $190,000 that money would have become by age 50 is abstract. We do not experience compound interest in the present tense. We only encounter its results or its absence decades later, at which point the decisions that created or prevented it are long past revisiting. The psychological mechanics of this bias are not a character flaw. They are a feature of human cognition under uncertainty, and they operate regardless of financial literacy. The second factor is social normalization. In communities where both parents work professionally, childcare is not a choice under examination. It is a background condition of life. It does not feel like a financial decision in the way that buying a car or taking a vacation does, because it does not feel voluntary. The conversation in peer groups is not about whether to pay for childcare, but about which center has the best curriculum, the lowest staff turnover, and the most convenient hours. The cost itself is treated as fixed and non-negotiable, which means it escapes the scrutiny that other discretionary expenses receive. This normalization is reinforced by a cultural narrative that frames childcare expenditure as an investment in child development rather than a consumption cost. There is genuine research supporting the developmental value of high-quality early childhood education. The Perry Preschool Project, the Carolina ABC Darien Project, and subsequent meta-analyses have documented long-term cognitive and socioeconomic benefits of quality early care for disadvantaged children. But the conflation of developmental framing with financial justification obscures the wealth impact at the household level. The value of childcare to the child's development does not change the opportunity cost calculation for the household's balance sheet. Both things can be true simultaneously, and they are, but treating them as the same argument prevents clear-eyed analysis of the financial trade-off.